The Hardening for Penal Reform has been working on the penal system as a whole. It's not just the prison system, the penal system as a whole, for nearly 150 years. And what we see is a system which is not healthy. It's not like the health service. It doesn't bring people in, make them better, and then put them back again. It's the opposite. It's quite toxic, and it's very inefficient, and it's very expensive. And if you look at the whole of the penal system, it's huge amounts of energy, huge amounts of public money, lots of people working very hard, lots of wonderful people doing some really good work, and actually the outcomes are not brilliant. So we try to find, my charity sort of looks at this and tries to find better ways of doing bits of it. We're not a huge charity, so we do our best. And we, for many, many years, have been spending a lot of time sort of catching the people once they've come into the system and they fall through like sausages out of the sausage machine. And so there's all this concentration, and the government has fallen into this trap of looking at resettlement. Well, that's after the damage has been done. That's after my house has been burgled, my car has been stolen, although somebody was saying that actually it's quite difficult to steal a car now, but they can still manage to scrape it or something, steal my handbag, whatever. That's too late. I want to stop people being victims of crime, and I want to try to make the system more efficient at the front end. So that basically is policing. So that's why my charity spent a lot more time recently looking at first-time entrants, and particularly concentrating on young people. Because if we can stop them coming in at first point of contact into the system, committing that first crime, getting involved in the system, we can do a lot of good. We can change lives, we can help people become crime-free citizens. So a lot more work recently on policing, and particularly, as I say, with children. We're going to release figures, so I'm not allowed to give them to you, so I might just hint at them, on Monday. We're doing some freedom of information gathering and some research looking at policing of children. And we've got a big conference on Thursday, so we're publishing the figures and the information ahead of that on Monday. And what we found is that more than 1 million children, or more than 1 million child arrests, have taken place in the last few years. And a considerable number of those are primary school-aged children. Now that's the bad news. The good news is that the numbers are really significantly reducing. We've gone to every police force in the country and got statistics over the last 4 years. And the numbers of arrests, child arrests, are really going down. Some police forces have managed to successfully reduce their child arrests by 2/3, which is fantastic, because it does mean that they can use their resources in dealing with the kind of crimes we've been hearing about, much more serious events, and we can really help to put resources where they should be. Our concern, I mean, it's both, my work the hardening work is at both ends, as I say. But if young people come into the system and they end up getting arrested, they go through the court system, they can end up in custody, and sadly, there are real tragedies in custody. And so the ultimate aim, the most extreme part of this, is to save children's lives. 34 children have died in custody since 1990, and that includes a 15-year-old and a 17-year-old this year. You may know about Adam Rickwood and Gareth Myatt, a 14-year-old and a 15-year-old who died in the secure training centres. One convicted of a relatively minor offence, one on remand. 14-year-old who took his own life, and a 15-year-old who died whilst he was being held down by staff, restrained by staff. So that's the extreme, and that's what I want to prevent. I want to prevent children dying, and I want to prevent people becoming their victims. Now, the bad news is that the research we've looked at and the research that we've conducted shows quite clearly that contact with the police is the start of a downward spiral. It's often not helpful. It's not like general practice. It's not like going to your GP who will sort you out and help you and give you either send you to the hospital or give you a prescription and therefore you will be better. It's not like that. Contact with the police is actually its goal. I was doing somewhere. Thank you. Well, you were doing somewhere. The Edinburgh study, the Edinburgh University study, was one of the biggest cohort studies of young people, 4,500 children over many years. And the children started in secondary school in Edinburgh in 1998, and it followed them through to see what their experiences were. And what this study found, and it's really, really important, it highlighted the dangers of potential problems caused by multiple and repeated interventions which inhibit some of these young people from desisting. So it's actually making things worse. So the deeper the children penetrated into the youth justice system, the more damaged they became and the less likely they were to stop. Let's go back. You just need to stop a while. Take a breath. Stop offending and grow out of crime. So young people who've been caught by the police were considerably more likely to continue offending than young people who had not been caught by the police in cohorts. So that's really, really a lesson for everybody. We've been doing a lot of work, particularly focusing on the arrest of children, because arrest of a child, a young person, can be life-blighting, as we found with the candidates who stood for police and crime commissioners. Many of them had trivial offences on their record 40 years ago. It meant that they couldn't stand for to be a PCC. So an arrest almost always leads to a sanction, and it can be life-blighting many, many years later. As I said, we've been doing these FOIs, looking at arrest rates, and we have found good news, but there is also unintended consequences of what's been going on with the arrests. Now, sometimes we found a lot of police where I've been talking to police, I've been talking to chief constables, I've been visiting them. I've recently spent an afternoon in the Gold Command Room of a police force not too far from here with the whole senior management team, talking about how they were investing huge amounts of effort in trying to stop the unnecessary arrests of children. So what they... I'm the world's least technical person. I need to give them something on this problem. Right, okay. Is that okay? Thank you. And what I found was that they were doing really well. They'd reduced their arrests of children. They'd been putting a lot of resources into restorative justice, and it all sounded great. Until we just started to unpick what was actually happening. And they put PCSOs into schools and clustered them. And they were looking at restorative justice and conflict resolution. So they told me an example. 2 or 3 kids, aged about 12, were in the playground and they were calling other children racist names. They were being anti-Semitic. So the PCSOs got involved with the school and they gave them a project on Judaism, and they took them off the synagogue, and that sounds absolutely great. And these kids understood about what they'd done was wrong, and that sounds great. But, because this was being managed by the police, it was being recorded by the police. And what happened was that it was recorded as a hate crime. So if these children, 10, 15 years later, applied to be, I don't know, go to medical school, or to work in a children's home, or to work with old people, and they did an enhanced CRB check, this could show up as a hate crime. And these were a couple of kids calling people names in the playground. So whilst I welcome a lot of really good effort going into trying to reduce unnecessary arrests of children, the informal consequences can be sometimes just as damaging. it wasn't clear where the discretion lay and who was going to make the decision about whether this was shown on a CRB check or not. The police didn't know, the senior management of the police didn't know, and the CRB people in that police force weren't sure either. I've since got an email that said, we think that it would be at the discretion of the Deputy Chief Constable. Well, that's not enough, actually. That's not good enough. There's got to be better guidance, there's got to be better gatekeeping on that. So this is the kind of thing we're involved in. We're talking about pre-arrest triage, we're talking to people about police officers, about resolving crimes, about getting officers professional discretion, about solution policing, and better links with local authorities. So challenging this PA system. We found, looking at what the police were doing, that too often children were being held for too long in police stations once they had been arrested. That sometimes they're held for hours and hours because you need to get an appropriate adult, it's not quick enough. Sometimes they're being held overnight because they don't want to wake them up, and if they come in late at night, they can't get someone to come and get them. The guidance for police is holding children is not appropriate. It's reliant and based on rules for adults, not for children. And Howardley believes that the framework should be based on the UN and on the UN Convention on Rights of the Child and on child protection. The well-being of the child should be the paramount consideration, because if we get that wrong, we're going to get it wrong for the rest of their lives. And the consequences for that child and the consequences for the rest of us will be very serious indeed. So there's some confusion amongst police now about what should happen to children. We found that some custody officers were only getting 1 day's training on children at best, how to deal with children, and issues were dealt with under general vulnerability, not child-specific. We found that police were saying they couldn't interview children if they were picked up late at night because they had to give them a night's sleep, so that if they came in at 11 o'clock, they didn't want to interview them at 12, so they let them sleep the whole night in the police cell, and then they interviewed them the next day, so then they couldn't go to school, and it was a cycle of getting worse and worse. We found in some police areas a lack of a good relationship and support from the local authority, so that sometimes, in the very rare cases a child needs local authority accommodation, that wasn't forthcoming. We found 5,000 children in a year who were refused court bail and were given a custodial remand. 5,000 children. But a third of them, when they came to court, were found not guilty. So thousands of children every year go through the system and end up in custody on remand in a prison or a secure training centre, and then they're found not guilty. So what would we like to see? As you know, I like round numbers, and I also like numbers. I have a 10-point plan, which I will go through very quickly, I promise. Police should resist arrest. Don't arrest when you don't need to. Events involving children should be resolved and dealt with using professional discretion in situ, where they happen. Resolving things, practical policing, is much better. We do not believe that a police station is a safe place for a child. I mean, there was some information that the BBC got, was it last week, about children with mental health problems and sometimes being held in police stations as a place of safety. It's outrageous, absolutely outrageous. Police stations are not safe and appropriate places for children, particularly if they've got mental health problems. We're calling for the age of criminal responsibility to be raised to 14, which is the European average. That's my time. I'll ignore it. I apologise about that. There's lots of challenges today. We want to see 17-year-olds treated as children by police. There's an anomaly that in every other area of law, civil and criminal law, a 17-year-old is treated as a child, apart from when they're dealt with by the police and they don't get an appropriate adult. And actually the Howard League is supporting a legal challenge, which is going to judicial review, where we are saying we've got a child who was arrested by the Met, so our judicial review is against the Met, and was refused an appropriate adult. So we're challenging that because we think that the 17-year-old should be able to get an appropriate adult, and should be treated as a child, as they are everywhere else. We would like to see a presumption of bail, with new criteria specific to children. Sixthly, we'd like to see a proper bail fostering system, so that if a child cannot go home because it's not a safe place for them, they should be able to be fostered. We'd like to see custody officers given appropriate training. And number 8, I'd like to see police officers and PCSOs taken out of schools. I think this has been a very retrograde step. Now I speak here, I have to declare, I started life as a secondary school teacher many years ago. And I think you give back responsibility for our children to parents and to schools. And I don't think that the place for the police is in schools. Police should be dealing with crime. And if there is a really serious crime, then they can go either by a teacher or by another member of staff or by a child, then they can go into the school to sort it out. The school can call them. But the kind of playground activity I described earlier should be dealt with by teachers and by schools, not by the police. The Convention on the Rights of the Child, the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child, should be the basis for all work with children. It gives proper framework for everybody who deals with children. Everybody should be able to quote large chunks of it. They should know, and that should be the main guidance, the framework, the principal framework for all work with young people. And number 10 on my list is that civil and human rights should be part of the curriculum. And this is really important because I want to teach children that the law is on their side. Too often, because of particularly certain groups of children, their experience with the law is always against them. It's the stop and search, it's the arrest, it's the conflict with the law. But actually, the law is there to protect all of us, and it should be on all of our sides, and it should be there to support all of us. And that's a very positive learning experience for children. So human rights and civil rights should be part of the curriculum. I want children to be active and positive and crime-free citizens. And unfortunately, if they get too involved in the criminal justice system and they get involved in the penal system, that doesn't happen. It's toxic, it's inefficient, it's expensive, and what it does is creates more crime when it's used inappropriately. We heard just earlier about really serious organised crime. That's where we should be concentrating our resources. Don't arrest a 12-year-old for calling somebody a name. Don't arrest a 10-year-old for stealing from the local shop. Sort it out at a local level, responsible policing, and let's put resources where they really matter. And treat children, all children, as if they were our own children, because they are. Thank you.
I'm sure you'll all agree with everything I said. A couple of questions for Francis.
Oh, I didn't stay long enough, did I?
Well, let me ask what maybe at some people's minds. I don't know. Take the police out of school. What about the police's role in prevention?
Well, it's not the police. I don't think the police do prevent. It's teachers who prevent. It's parents who prevent. It's people who give children a sense of responsibility, of citizenship, of duty, of engagement with each other, of care for each other, of a sense of justice, a sense of what's right, all those sorts of things, and what prevent crime. And in the few children who have very special, particular needs, the children who are facing a neglect or abuse or who have real problems, then it's social services and local children's services who should get involved. The How-Deep Penal Reform ran a programme for 10 years called Citizenship and Crime Prevention. And we worked with more than 25,000 children across the country on a 2-day programme where we looked at we talked to them about what is a crime, how do you know what a crime is, what's the law, how does policing work, what does a court look like, and how do you prevent crime. And it is very clear that when you talk to children and young people about that sort of thing, we took a lot of police in to do it because they're all volunteer run, because we're a charity, we don't have much money, and that's how you prevent crime, by giving children knowledge and engagement and expertise and power to a certain extent. You don't prevent crime by arresting them, actually, you make things worse.
No? Nothing more?
There's one at the back.
All right.
Hi, I'm Mark Gale. I'm a police officer and former custody sergeant. I wholeheartedly agree with you, what you say in relation to children in custody. However, there is also the issue, as you quite rightly mentioned, in relation to local authority taking their responsibility. One of the things you mentioned was not interviewing a youth when he's been brought in, for example, after 11 o'clock at night. When social services say to you, you will not do that, we will not provide an appropriate adult to you, that becomes very, very difficult. When you phone a parent and the parent says to you, I'm not getting out of bed, keep them there to teach them a lesson, that becomes very difficult. There are other people involved in this other than the police. We do have our part to play. I'm a parent of 3 children, and I do agree that we should treat them more like they were own. The last thing you want is children in custody, and the Police Federation have been saying for years and years that children and mental adults, custody is not a place for them. We are not a place of safety. So there are other people. I thought you gave the police a bit of a kick in there. So I'd just like to say I do support some of what you say, but there is a balancing act.
I absolutely agree with that. And I think if a parent does say, well, I'm not coming to fetch my child, that in itself is something that should be dealt with, perhaps by the police, because they are not fulfilling. It's the parental responsibility there to take the child, to come and fetch the child from the police station. It's not the child's fault that it's got crap parents. You know, somebody needs to do something about those parents. And that really is, I think, is where the problem, the child is ending up being punished for something which is the parent's fault. So yeah, I would then say to social services, well, what are you doing about that parent? What are you doing about giving them parenting lessons, about making sure they fulfil their responsibility? I don't know, anyway, when my child was ending up down the police station, I'd be down there so quick, you know. That's what you have to do as a parent. You have a responsibility sometimes to do things that are frightening or unpleasant or difficult with your kids and to protect them and support them. So I think the shift has got to be to give responsibility to parents, to local authorities in extreme circumstances, and away from policing. So I entirely sympathise with what you're saying, and it's not the police's fault that they've ended up with this kid. Sort the parents out.
And there's one on the way around here. I think better be the last one.
Institute of Criminal Justice Studies in the University of Portsmouth. I agree with some of your ideals and aspirations, and the word children is very emotive, because obviously we like to think of children as very young people, innocent, vulnerable people themselves, and whilst an awful lot of them suffer victimisation themselves, you do have to address the real concerns of people that are victims of these children, particularly antisocial behaviour that can make other vulnerable people their lives a misery. I think, you know, I agree with what you're saying, but it's about being realistic about what can be achieved, and some of the issues and social issues that we have to change. You know, there's been attempts at being making parents more accountable, but some parents can't be accountable. So I think it's more about education and prevention in schools, but in the meantime, you do have to respond to the fears and concerns of local communities that are suffering from some of these young people whose behaviour is, you know, unacceptable and causes high levels of fear.
Yes, I understand that completely. I mean, I use the word child because that's the legal term, and under 18 is the legal term, internationally and nationally, and we recognise and enshrine that in law, although we are a little confused about what age you can do what. You know, you can have sex at 17, but you can be a criminal at 10. You're not allowed to buy cigarettes until you're 18, but you can, you know, being locked up in custody at 10 actually, or in prison at 15. So we are very confused about at what age people are held responsible for what kinds of decisions. And yes, when children are creating a nuisance, but antisocial behaviour is it should not be criminal. It's a bloody nuisance. We know it is. It can be very distressing. But it's not, it shouldn't be criminalised, because if you go down that route, you make it worse. You guarantee that they will be on a trajectory, a lifetime of more crime and more antisocial behaviour, and will cost a fortune. What we do, and the way we respond as parents, as local authorities, as police, as academics, as adults across the piece, the way we respond to that sort of behaviour makes a huge difference to what happens in the outcomes. And if we get it wrong, we will suffer for many years to come. There are things you can do, there are better ways, as you know with your own kids. There are things that you do that just set up more and more conflict and make things worse, as with other people's kids. That's why I say the principles of parenting should be applied to all children.